Hi everyone, thank you for coming. I'm Miriam Kent, I'm a lecturer in media and communication. I should be joined by my frequent collaborator from the School of Design, Eirini Boukla. We are hosting this event, which is called Comics, Practice and Theory. Thank you so much for coming. We are hosting this as part of Thought Bubble Comic Arts Festival, and thank you to them, and thank you to our funders as well, the Leeds Arts and Humanities Research Institute and School of Media and Communication. I don't want to waste any more time, so I'm just going to say why we are here. Presumably either because we like comics, or we do academic research, maybe in creative ways, and some of us might be interested in doing both at the same time. But in any case, we probably feel that comics are a really unique, special medium, and we want to celebrate the things that comics can do. So an overarching kind of question for today, for our panel to discuss, is how can comics be a tool for research, for communication, and for creative critical practice? To think about that, we curated a small exhibition downstairs, which hopefully you'll be able to have a look at if you haven't done so already. That's all work from previous events that we've run as part of a kind of comics speakers series. This event itself is kind of a pilot for what we hope will be more of these kinds of events, or maybe kind of workshops, training kind of sessions. There are, on that note, questionnaires in front of you, and there's also the little postcards that have a QR code on the back. Please take some time to fill in the feedback form at the end of the session. We really, really appreciate it, and hopefully if you like what we've done today, we'll be able to do more of this kind of stuff. So I'm going to invite our roundtable speakers to respond to some carefully curated questions. We probably won't have time for all of them, but yeah, it's going to be entirely kind of speaker-led kind of discussion. To introduce our speaker, you are sitting in order, so that's very good. We are pleased to welcome Karrie Fransman, acclaimed comics creator who's worked with a wide variety of artistic media and has appeared in many publications. Karrie has a very kind of flexible understanding of what comics can be. We have Dr Davies, who is a leading scholar in the kind of communicative functions of comics and also creates comics as part of his research. And Wiseman, who is a writer of comics, a local writer, and also works locally at the university, who co-created an Eisner-nominated research comic, Pocus, which we have on the table over there, which is a really good example of a collaboration between a writer, a comic book writer, a comic book artist, and an academic, who in this case was a psychologist. So I'm going to ask our panel to do a brief kind of 5-minute overview, and I'm going to be like really strict about the 5-minute thing because like we are running behind. So I noticed that some of you had quite a few slides. So I'm going to hand over to them in a second. FYI, we are recording the event, although the cameras are facing this way. We will be taking some photos throughout. If we take a photo near you, we will be asking your permission. If you don't want to appear in the photo, that's fine, just let us know. But that will be for kind of research purposes and circulation with Thought Bubble and colleagues. Okay, so who's going first on the slide? That's Paul.
Yeah.
You have the...
Oh, that one will do as well.
There's that one, and we can share this one. That's all right. Okay.
Okay, I'm just going to set 5 minutes. Can I just check you can hear me if I speak at this volume? Is that okay at the back there? Yeah, good. Okay, cool. I will carry on speaking at this volume now. Yeah, so I'm Paul Davies, and my thing is, I'm the token academic, I suppose, on the panel. My thing is comics as communication, per se. So in my book here, which was developed from my thesis, used the work of Michael Halliday and that kind of linguistics, his systemic functional linguistics, to kind of make sense of how comics do what language does. Language presents, ideas. There's an ideational function. Language also interacts with people, the interpersonal function, and it constructs text. And different languages use different forms to do those things. And so my argument for using linguistics to make sense of comics is that comics have forms that can do those things too. So that presents us with a basis on which we can make a case for linguistics being a useful framework to think about comics. And this in part came from my own comics creation alongside a bunch of students we created like 24-hour comics together, and we found that the existing theory maybe didn't speak to us. So through creation, that led to the thesis stuff. And whilst I have been working on academics and going to lovely events like this and to comics scholarship, I've been taking sketch notes and producing comics work, producing theoretical work in comics form. So here on this screen, we have a collaboration. The Sequentials website is an open source, open access comics journal, which only does comics form productions. And so this was for a special edition called Queer Encounters. I don't have the bona fides to be a queer scholar, but my friend Joe does. So we collaborated together and used language, of course, to make sense of these things. Comics don't use as many words on the whole. And when we initially scripted this, one of the interesting things was that Joe wrote extensive scripting, extensive academic sentences, and we needed to cut them right down. Tom Giddens' collection there, Critical Directions in Comic Studies, invited a range of academics to write not only academic essays, like 8,000-word chapters, but also what he called comics interludes. And so on the cover there is an extract or assorted panels from my comics interlude contribution, which was about framing of comics and the way that comics are nested like Matryoshka dolls in assorted context and then subcontext and then stories within inside stories. Okay, and forthcoming, looking to the future, Nancy Petrie's collection focuses on comics and intermediality. Comics, of course, are made into films. Films may be made into comics, and comics themselves are an interaction between the art and the words. My chapter in there talks about the way that language is kind of fundamental to collaboration, to thinking about comics, even when you are the sole writer, and even when your comic is silent, you may well use language to conceptualize it and sort of tell the story in your head and take notes about it. And so Nancy chose a panel from Queer Encounters there, alongside Alison Bechdel on the cover, which I was very proud of. Next slide, please. And so there's also been a special edition, which has been called for, I think it's coming up soon. My guess is 2026. We have the proposal, which was done in comics form there, rather loosely. I pushed it a little bit with how much I relied on the editors, realizing that this was enacting a sort of looseness and rushness. And the comic that's coming up then is about academic writing and comics, and takes Helen Sword's stylish academic writing and looks at the ways in which comics could capture the things that she identifies. She looks at a range of academic writing and asks whether it's true that you should never use I, for example, or that you always use abstract nouns, which is often the case. Next slide. But when she comes to compile what she feels are stylish academic writing features, they're very comicsy. She says that stylish academic writing uses concrete nouns and interesting stories and visual illustrations and humour. And of course, this is what comics has been made for. And increasingly, there are the kind of things that you saw in the foyer. Nick Susannis' work, Neil Cohn's doing work with this, and everybody else, including people on this panel, are helping to forge that style of comics. Looking ahead further into the future, this panel itself and thinking about it made me think about my next project, which will start with words, the words from the glossary in my comic. I realise that's 5 minutes. But I'm going to try, and I'm pitching it to you now, so I have to finish it, to do my glossary from the end of my book, but each page then will be a page of comics where I do not use words to explain things. I use image to explain them, okay? And if we go on to the next page, then there will be references to different pages in the glossary that will use visual reflections, arrows, exemplars, visual metaphors, and so on. And yeah, that's what I'm working on now. So I need a publisher. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Paul. We're going to move swiftly on to Karrie, who's going to introduce what she's all about.
I'm going to rely on you telling me when I need to. Oh yeah. I think I might be the token artist. On panel, you're writer, right?
Yes.
I'm the token artist. Hi. So my background is I've worked for a variety of places, from art institutions to journalists. Everywhere. The United Nations, British Red Cross, Guardian Times, Time Out, BBC Arts Council, many more. I've done 4 books, and most relevant for today, I'm creative director at Positive Negative, an organisation that amplifies research through comics and animation, and also I'm one of the founding members of the Comics Cultural Impact Collective. So we're trying to raise awareness of the value of comics, gathering research, and kind of making people aware of the psychological, social, educational, and economical value of comics in the UK. I'm also currently artist in residence at the Royal Society of Literature. Next slide, please. So this is just one example of a project I did with Durham University called Density, which was looking at protest crowds. So here I'm cutting up maps in places where these events happened in the story, and I'm interviewing a refugee from Sarajevo to London about her story, and also a protest organizer. Right? This is Positive Negative. If you go to the next slide, you can just for 1 minute of our time look at their showreel, our showreel. So you can't really hear the audio very well, but essentially this is an organisation who's been going for 12 years now, working with academics. We create animation and comics, so it's got the benefit of both and going out to slightly different places. And you can see the variety of styles. So we're working with academics from all over the world, 46 different countries, and teaming them up with artists in those countries. So when I create a director project, I'm finding artists from Hanoi, Karachi, and collaborating with researchers in all those countries as well. So it's really exciting, and we've got so much evidence of the power of comics to engage mass audiences. Research which would have sat in a library on a shelf with maybe 100 people reading it, we can now engage millions and get quite a lot of kind of media coverage as well, kind of from the big kind of BBC, Guardian, places like that as well. So that's positivenegative.org. So definitely check them out if you're interested in this, and you can read all of their comics for free, and also they've got like kind of learning resources which go alongside. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. So this is an example of a recent project which I did with them, which was about water scarcity. And this is the team I was working with. So they're artists from Zimbabwe, Sri Lanka, the UK, Bangladesh, and Romania. Yeah. And a researcher from Somalia as well. So it was a massive global project. Next, please. And these are some of the comics which they produced. With these projects, we often try and create comics which then can also be animations, and the comics can be handed out in villages, given back to people who've been interviewed and whose stories have been told, and the animations can reach like a wider lay audience, but it can also be used at the beginning of conferences. So all the different techniques have slightly different purposes. This is one which I made. Sometimes I don't creative direct. We can maybe watch, I don't know, a second of this. So this was, I don't actually know how to animate, so when I'm asked to animate, this is the kind of nonsense I produce. So this was a project when I had to look at the story of migration instead of telling a personal story, which we usually do. I had to look at migration in itself. So each page is a bit of a different sort of interaction. So yeah, next one, we can just get, you can look at it online, I'm sorry. Going so fast, it's 5 minutes. Or we could just watch Peppa Pig, have a brain break. So this, and the impact is really important. So with that film, it was featured in The Guardian and got 96,000 views. We call it like the opposite of false news. We're working with the experts on these subjects, and they're giving us all the information, and I can be the useful idiot who turned it into pictures and puts it out online. So yeah, The Guardian featured that it was translated into 8 languages, nominated for Arts and Humanities Research in Film Award, for Best Animation, which is funny because I don't know how to animate. So next one, please. And this is the Comics Cultural Impact Collective, and our motto is "A rising tide lifts all boats." Next, please. I mentioned before, we're gathering research, building an evidence for why comics should get better funding. So we've got loads of data on there. If you need any evidence why you should be using comics in a grant proposal, please go and look at the Comic Cultural Impact Collective.org, or get in contact with us. There's so much evidence there and so much data we've gathered. Next, please. There's also this useful 2-page article which we did for the bookseller, which kind of summarizes some of the kind of value of comics. Next, please. Yeah, that's it. And you can find me at karriefransman.com for my work. If you're interested in positive negative work, go to positivenegative.org or the Comic Cultural Impact Collective.
I made a slide.
Thank you. Yeah, hi, I'm Rick Worth. I didn't submit any slides, so I'll have to paint a picture with my words. Yeah, it's really useful, but thankfully Miriam has. So I guess the perspective I can add from this is more from the creative side of work for hire, freelancing, and kind of creative advisor to a lot of projects. So when I started in comics, we started in like 2010, around that time, in the small press UK scene, and it was going through an explosion then. It was really getting a lot more professional. But I was really obsessed with what comics could do as a format, and how we might do things in comics that we couldn't do elsewhere. And then I worked with my partner, Jordan Collver, who's also worked on the, what was it called?
Density.
Yeah, Density, that's it. Yeah, so we started doing lots of work for hire on lots of different projects, of like adverts. And then we started to create these small shorts for things that we were just interested in, that comics, that there was really no kind of commercial value to. So we wanted to explain things like Occam's razor, for example, because we were both kind of into the skepticism movement of the time. And eventually that kind of got us the attention of Professor Richard Wiseman, who's a parapsychologist, who's the dean of the community, like for promoting the communication of science. And that's when we started working on the project that you can see on the screen, Hocus Pocus, and it's just here. So that was paid for by Australian skeptics group, something like that, and they wanted to create a comic as part of a communications project that would have academic input into it and some kind of research taken out of it. So it was an entire series looking at the world of parapsychology and illusion, which really appealed to us because one of the things that we were kind of interested in, and I was just explaining before, is there's a kind of a psychological trick pulled in comics that, if anyone's read Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, you'll know this thing where, you know, you see someone's hand raised in the air with an axe, and then the next panel is a scream. Something happens in that gutter in your mind that tells you that the axe has fallen and killed people. That's not happened. That has not even happened on the page. You've not seen it, but it compels you to think it does. So we were able to blend in magic tricks in that, because of course magic works in much the same way that there's a presumption in panel one. There's a setup in panel one. There's a presumption in the gutter that you don't know about, and then the second panel usually twists that round on its head. So through that work as well, we started working with a number of researchers, including I think they're called like BAMLA labs over in the States, who do lots of work with insects and micro robots, which has been interesting. And then we've worked on a few kind of commercial products, particularly one in particular for a company called Transmissible EU, who work on vaccines. So for them, for example, we've produced material which is taking research and historical information about the thalidomide disaster and creating that into teaching modules for students studying pharmacology and understanding how that chain works. So the entire point of the program was to present what happened in that disaster in compartments, like what part of the processes went wrong. And the spoiler, all parts of the processes went wrong. But it was to teach them that, you know, if you're on chemical design, you are not distanced from marketing, and then you're not distanced from retail. So that was a really useful kind of example of how we were able to come in and talk about story as a way of telling those and making those examples, rather than just academic papers or lecturers standing up and saying, these are things you need to be aware of. It was hilarious. I really enjoyed it. So one of the things that I'm really interested in from comics and from a kind of a work for hire perspective and working with academics is making academia and learning more accessible to a wider audience. So comics is uniquely positioned for that. Not just because you can simplify and make things more interesting, but comics is also, and historically has been, a kind of a ghettoized art form. There's very little class barrier to it. So, even if you write a pop science book, that's super accessible, there may still be some kind of barrier there to access, or not just access, involvement. There's still these kind of hidden barriers that stop people from low-income backgrounds making and creating this content. And I think comics, by taking this work and putting it in that format, you start to break down those barriers, which works both ways. It means the entry into the subjects is easier, and also academics, when they're not talking to each other and not talking to themselves, which they can do quite a lot, and that's okay. But when they don't want to speak to each other, comics is a really accessible and fun format for that. What's my time looking like?
Probably over. I think you did really well to summarize them. So I'm gonna give you some prompts. That was fine. We'll probably our roundtable discuss.
Before we do that, we were just discussing asking the audience a few questions.
Sure.
Put your hands up if you have ever collaborated. Put your hand up if you're an academic, and put your hand up if you're an artist and academic. And have you ever done a comic academic collaboration before? A few. And did you like it? Put your hand up if you did. And hand up who's interested in doing a comic academic collaboration, who'd like to work in that. Okay. And the rest of you do not want to work in it, so we've got to convince you, right? Okay, great.
You can tell that you work in data gathering. That was really good.
I hope we can change if there's some creators who are not academics, who are not interested in working in academia, I hope we can change some minds by the end of it, because there are really good reasons to do it.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll
money.
Fund it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of set you off with some questions. I'm going to let you kind of do the discourse for as long as it kind of goes, and if it peters out, that's fine. If there's a bit of time at the end, we don't want to keep people for too long. We also have snacks and drinks downstairs if you want to partake of snacks and drinks and looking at artwork. So we may not have time for Q&A, but obviously come and have a chat with us afterwards in any case. Okay, so I'm going to just get us started with question one. What is the fundamental gap or potentially the connection that you see between the realm of academic research and that of comics creation?
Storytelling.
Yeah.
One word, right? I think there's a fundamental link between education and storytelling. I don't know, was it Sean York who did Into the Woods, was it? I'm terrible at remembering.
Yeah.
And he does that kind of 3-act structure where you see the baby crawling towards the frame. That's act 1. Act 2, the baby touches the frame. Act 3, the baby cries and has learned not to touch the flame. That idea that a story is fundamentally a character undergoing a change, transforming. There's something fundamentally which connects learning and storytelling. I think it is very crucial to our nature, and I think comics is a really accessible form of storytelling which predates literature. It's not oral storytelling. I think oral storytelling probably came first. Then someone drew with a stick in the sand or paint on the wall. And I think yes, for me that's the link.
Mm-hmm. And this was the discovery from looking at Helen Sword's research into academic work, is that it is at its best when it's telling a story, when it's giving illustrations, when it's kind of funny, when it's vivid and using images. conceptual images to explain what's going on. And so it was kind of striking how Sword didn't have comics at all in her mind when she wrote that text. She was just trying to get writing in academia to be a bit less boring and a bit more enjoyable. But the connection between that and what comics can do, particularly given the potential challenge that you might feel like comics are just not fitted or not well equipped or haven't been worked on historically or traditionally to be able to do these things, well, that's given the lie to by Sword's research. And I think the other thing that comics then can do is visual metaphor then, and make vivid and lay out in space something that perhaps wants to be visually conceived and doesn't actually like being linear. Some conceptual ideas, some academic ideas actually might work better in that way, where you are not forced to go through it from A to B to C, and that any path through it. This is true in teaching as well. Through language, you've got to take some kind of path, either from the high level down to the low level, or the other way round. And in a comic, potentially, you could have it not be that way, so you can forge your own path through material.
Yeah, I would agree with both of you. You've done both of the good points. In particular, what you were saying about, the visual metaphor. There's a certain aspect of comics that can both kind of condense and integrate things, but also expand on things. So, when we, in our work, we get sent academic papers and say we want to make this into a 4-page comic or whatever, and it's 16 pages of quite dense text. And the thing I always say to John and Collver, my collaborator, is we've got to understand what the client wants to say, and that what is important in this paper, and what is the trimmings of academic writing. Because there's academics in this room. You've all been trained to write an academic way, and you've been told to do that so that other academics can understand you. And often that means quite long, complicated, in-depth, very, very specific sentences. Now you can unpack those sentences in a couple of panels, if you want, and describe every single kind of contingent factor around whatever concept you're describing, and then ascribe it to a character, and then have that character go off and do stuff, because that character is carrying all that verbal packaging. So then you're free to move around a lot more and take that idea, and like you say, it's from a reader perspective as well. You're reading left to right and down the page if you're writing in a Western language, I suppose. Because comics don't do that, they make you think about the relations of these concepts to one another. So the spatial relations on the page are the spatial relations of these concepts. So, you want to briefly allude to, this is very important in robotics because of Asimov's law. And then you expect your academic audience to know what Asimov's law is. In comics, you can just have an aside. It can be very, very small because it's very, very brief. Or it can be very, very big on the page because you're like, actually, this is so important for you to understand this. This can buy more time. So, yes, what you said, and hopefully I've added to it.
I think it's interesting, sorry, just a slightly tangent and probably to cross into other questions, but maybe to question why the word has dominated academic understanding for so long. When you look at visual communication and oral communication, why have those been sidelined? And what do we lose when we go from one to the other? Yeah, and I mean, I'm just as much a fan of kind of other forms of communication than just the word, but I often wonder that, because I do think there is a sort of hierarchy, which we see even weirdly with, in publishing, when a writer's name goes before the illustrator's name. There's a sort of, in the UK particularly, a dominance of the word over images. But each of these art forms gives you different potentials and different barriers. And I think, like you said, that kind of linear form of language, you can't show the spatial connection. Yeah.
It can be really difficult to abandon the word. One of the things that I found while working with Joe on the Queer Encounters was his rather brief academic outline. I tried to draw just the first paragraph, and it took an entire page to even get halfway through. And at that point I stopped and said, we cannot do this. You have to abandon most of these words, get it down to the absolute pith. And then his second script was like concrete poetry, in that there were little words here and there laid out on the page enacting their relationship to each other rather than spelling out or wording their relationship to each other. And it can be quite scary as an academic or for an academic writer to abandon words and let images be there. And difficult for readers too, because you kind of want a path through. And I think a lot of the work that's here does maintain a path. It busts it up sometimes, but there's words in there to read through. And we tend to skip much quicker through images when they're images alone. But if the word's in there, we slow down for the words.
But yeah, that's something we got told. We got told on the job recently, was like, oh, you can do this wonderful thing, but unless you've not got the little caption boxes, it's just like kind of road bumps. People will just gloss over something. And I was just thinking as you were saying that, comics is still like a relatively young medium, about as old as cinema, I guess. In over its whatever, like nearly 100-year, like as we understand it, form, it's evolved as a tool so quickly. So if you read any old, any Golden Age comic, you'll see, Superman punching a villain, and then the caption box will say, Superman thwarts the villain with a mighty punch. And, most comics have kind of evolved past that, the box is describing what's in the image. So as it's doing that, what I was thinking, that's kind of a parallel to anyone who's a teacher will probably know that, like, show, don't tell, that's the rule in comics. Yeah. If you show someone an experiment, you get someone to do the experiment, they understand those concepts more than if they're in the abstract and just the writing. And I think people forget that just a body of text is, it's literally an abstract in some cases, but it is abstract. You're just seeing symbols that are meant to represent the same things that images are meant to do. At the same time, kind of going back to the start of comics, like Will Eisner, the godfather of the graphic novel, one of the things that he did that loads of people just don't kind of realize is that he wrote instructional comics where the texts were very clear, straightforward instructions for the military. So like how to clean your gun, how to like fix an engine, things that were really practical that taught the average soldier with like low literacy skills how to do their job properly. But it was accompanied by humorous illustrations or a humorous plot. So comics can flip around. They can either be low text, example images, or very clear, straightforward text, distractionary images, or images that bring something quite dull to life a bit more to make it stick in your memory.
I guess what you're kind of gesturing towards is, the possibilities of comics being used as a form of research or to assist in research. Are there any times when comics might not be the right medium?
This came up, I was talking at Oxford Torch Research about doing sketchnoting and the fact that I would draw little pictures of the people, and that sort of emphasizes the social and the embodied nature of academic research. And talk through the way that you might draw little things that people were presenting, and that some people doing sketch notes would really lean into the visual metaphor kind of thing. And somebody in the audience said, would you recommend that my physics students do this? And I was like, well, no, not necessarily. Okay, there may be horses for courses, but to feel like if your physics students do want to do drawings, if it would make sense to express it like that, then it may well offer a different modality, but to make sense of something, it may be quicker to do the drawing than to try and word it. And the two things can work together.
I think it's an audience, isn't it? If your audience is absolutely a word audience, then don't draw visual, don't give them visual. I think, whenever we're creating any comic, we're very much thinking about who we're talking to, and that's always the first question I ask with these projects. Who's your audience? And there's some people who really do not understand comics. I've bought my mum countless comics, and she just doesn't know which way they go, or she just can't read them. And I think for certain people, they don't make sense. But I would say the younger generation are increasingly becoming visually literate because they're navigating text and images on computers, and their attention spans are shrinking as well, sadly. But I'm not saying that comics isn't just as in-depth and intellectual, whatever, rich medium as literature, but I do think the younger generation are more inclined towards it.
Yeah, I can't really add to that other than that there are a few, like, there are practical limitations to comics. So, if you need some research translated into a comic and you need it in 2 days, that's probably not going to happen. Like, they are a bit more labor intensive than writing a Word document. We've recently had a kind of a client say, "Oh, just off the back of that one, I wonder what you could do with this," and give us a 20-page academic paper with highly complex and conceptual things. And it was like, "What can you do in 3 pages?" And I was like, "Nothing that would be useful for you. Like, we can make something that looks pretty, or we can pick one concept out, but I can't." But it was a case of they didn't really know what they wanted it for. They just wanted to see something cool, which I completely appreciate. But we could get into this as well. If you're a creator, or if you're on the creator side of this relationship, it's kind of your responsibility to make sure you're checking that with your client or collaborators to make sure that they know what they want out of it and that you deliver properly for them.
You need 3 times as many pages rather than 3 times fewer pages.
Yes.
And 3 times as much budget.
Yes,
and time.
So, I mean, there's a question here around what your relationship to the research is if you're making a comic out of it. And sometimes that can be like a work for hire kind of situation, or like in your case, Paul, it could be like the artist and the academic are the same person. What difference does it make? And also maybe thinking, have there been moments where the act of creating the comic have changed, the ideas that you're communicating or researching?
You go first.
Yeah, so it was different working with another academic in the ways I've outlined. Just you've got to kind of get them into the idea of what you can possibly do on a page. When you're working yourself and thinking about things, sometimes the drawing will come first, or the image in the mind will come first. And the nice thing about that is you can just draw it, do the table, do the chart, do the triangle or something like that, lay things out in space first, and then think about how you are going to word those or connect those, or what path you might take through them. The challenge for the idea that I presented at the end, of course, where I'm going to start with words and then try and do everything with the constraint that I'm not going to word it at all. I'm not going to use clauses to get across my ideas. This is a kind of interesting thing to work through, especially where you've got something straightforward like an existential sentence, essentially, which Helen Sword said was quite frequent in academia, just saying X is Y. It's quite difficult to communicate just is in a comic. You can use equals, of course, but talking about pure things existing is relatively challenging. And I'm feeling as I go through that project, there might be sort of overlap and the same kind of images that are used for one term as another, but maybe that's going to be okay. Maybe that's the point of doing that.
I feel like I was thinking about it for so long that I forgot what the actual question was.
It was around your relationship to the research.
Oh, yes, yeah. So I think it's important to ask 2 questions. It's basically the same question for yourself as a creator and for the academic. It's why does an audience care? So the first, like, as a creator, you're basically the first audience, right? Because you're making this up in your mind. So if you're the creator and you ask an academic, be kinder than why do you care? But why should other people care? But, if someone spent 7 years of their lives studying a very, like a piece of bacteria that does something that's phenomenal to their field, you've got to ask, why is that going to be important to another audience? So that's like the first step. And the second thing is you've got to find something in it that you can get out of it from a creative process as well. So sometimes you do work for hire and the client knows exactly what they want, and they'll even, I've been given scripts before, and you go, okay, can I deviate from this? And you're like, no. And you're like, okay, we just do what they say then. And, it comes out however it comes out. So yeah, try and find something that kind of sparks joy in you, or, some approach or even some comics technique that you would like to try out that you might not really have an opportunity to do something in like a more commercial piece of work for like just an entertainment publisher. And And then there was one last bit that's just escaped me as I was saying that. No, I'll pass it on.
Come back to you. If it comes back, interrupt me. No, it's interesting. It's interesting thinking about that kind of process. Just with that example which I showed about the water scarcity project which we did, there was a lot of really quite technical information on systems of water irrigation collection in all these different countries. But it was really interesting because I often say to the academics, like, if you were sitting next to someone at a dinner party and you had to tell them about your research, like, what would you say to make it, like, really interesting? What would be your anecdote? You wouldn't launch into the, details of the, irrigation systems. And, some academics really respond to that. They're really creative. And I remember a Somalian researcher saying, I collaborate with the researchers and then I write the script. And often I'm like, trying to draw it out. But with her, she was super creative and she was like, I want to tell the story from the perspective of the water, like the body in water moving through these systems. And so we did this really great kind of more poetic story where she was like the water. And then there was another for the same, because we were doing like 5 scripts on water scarcity in 5 different places. And then the last one, I came up with the idea of a grandmother living in a utopia of water equality and abundance. And she's looking back to see, how did we get here? And that was just like, again, just another curveball which made writing about the same subject really interesting. But what you need is the kind of, support, creative support and freedom of your collaborator. Ideally, it's funny because we both use the word collaborator and client, and it's very different, isn't it? You know quite well when you start working with someone if they are a client or a collaborator. And the collaborations definitely work a lot better if they're the kind of trust that you can both give each other some space to experiment and to, bounce ideas. They're definitely the more the better collaborations, really. Yeah, otherwise you're just doing like drawing and soul destroying.
You brought my thought back to me when you mentioned about the types of story you were pitching, and this is just kind of like a kind of a practical thing for like a working relationship. Is that sometimes the person you're working with has not read comics, or even if they have read comics, they might have read a certain type of comic. And even if they've read a certain type of comic, they might not have read as much comics theory as you have, or even when we worked on Hocus Pocus, we told Richard Wiseman to read Understanding Comics, so that he would have like a shared basic language of when I sent him the script, what was happening. But on a lot of work where I do, when we write the script, I kind of write what the creative justification is in it for, so that the academic doesn't panic and be like, why have you decided that there's going to be no dialogue on this page? There was dialogue on the other 3 pages, and you go, there is a reason. It will create a sense of like emptiness or whatever. So you've kind of got to walk them through creative choices and just reassure them that you're not a maniac. And also that they kind of know the ins and outs of comics. So even stuff like making sure, you label a caption balloons clearly in the script and saying this on the page, this will clearly be coming from, this character, and it will represent inner thought. So, you don't have to explain to them like, they're idiots, but some kind of artistic context for what you're doing is so helpful for people.
Yeah, I find that whenever I collaborate with academics, they're really, really involved with the script, and sometimes there'll just be so many arguments about really specific words. And it tends to be the case that once the script is signed off, they're much more like, do what you want with the art. And to be honest, that's good. It's the ones who are like, the backseat artists where that's really tricky, because you've got to trust that what a comic creator is doing isn't just drawing the pictures for it's not like you're the director and they're the cameraman. They are storytellers, they're the communicators. And the more you can trust them to do their job well, the better. So yeah, that's what, I don't know, that's my experience.
Yeah, comics, the medium itself, will do some of the work for you. It's just going to be putting in the pictures.
Yeah.
I think in a way, if you look at your research and you think, oh, this can't be done in comics, great, actually, because that's going to present you a massive problem. You've got to rethink what you're doing, and that can be hugely productive.
Yeah.
My PhD was at Sussex, and in Brighton they did pub HD, right, where you got like 5 minutes in a pub to communicate the idea of your PhD, and it's obviously quite a challenge to do that, but great, what a great exercise to go through.
Yeah.
And likewise with putting it as a comic, it will sharpen your mind about what really matters, like you say.
Yeah. That understanding, you know, you when an academic talks to you about a job, you trust they've got the qualifications to back it up to you, but you trust that they know what they're talking about. So when they have those discussions with you, it's like, I know you absolutely must use this phrase, and you're like, okay, that speech bubble is going to be massive now because it's a really long word. You know, you're thinking of those kind of things. But at the same time, they've kind of got to trust that you know the medium and you know how it technically works, in the same way that if someone said to you, no, we can't film, you just sat there for 8 hours writing because it's really boring, we need some explosions, you would trust that director a bit more, you know. So yeah, it's about establishing that you're from different fields and you're equal in your knowledge of what you're working together on.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a theme that's emerging, that there is a difference between an academic coming up to you and being like, well, just draw this.
Yeah.
Do the public engagement side of
Yeah.
the project, right? Just draw this, or like make a film, right? Which that is a very kind of unbalanced relationship. Kind of on that note, what might an equitable partnership or collaboration between a researcher and a creator look like? And what are the things that are, you know, preventing that from happening?
I think a period where you, like, what I love is, first of all, I ask the academics I work with to distill all of that research. I've been sent 90 pages of research before, and I'm like, hell no, I cannot do that. I'm like, distill it and distill it and distill it. And when, I say, depending on the research, and depending on the output, I'm like, can you send me that in 2 pages? Which is terrifying for a lot of academics. You're like, oh, I've been working on this for 9 years and you want to turn me in, 2 pages. But that's what I want to see in the first instance. So they've kind of done some of the editing to get it down to the essentials. And it's kind of like an hourglass figure. You start really wide with all your research and you slowly distill and distill and distill. And then what you should get to in the narrowest point is your brief, which should be, who am I talking to? The why. Why am I talking to them? What is the message? What do they want to do? What's the output going to be? Where are they going to see it? All of these really practical points. And then you come up with your idea. And that can be a back and forth. What I like to do is get all the information, and then I like to have a think about some ideas. And then that part, the ideas, how are we going to communicate this, can be a real joyful creative collaboration between 2 people. And then you can go off and start mapping it out. And it also becomes a part in that, so you start wide, go very narrow, and then you're more creative again once you've defined your brief. But I would say that the part when it gets really ugly, when you show them it, and I always say to them, this is your rough. When you see the rough from the script, it looks awful. And I'm always like, it will look pretty, I promise you. Sometimes I show a picture of the finished art right next to the roughs, and you can see how bad it looks in the middle, but you kind of have to have the faith.
What you don't want is when you show them the final page and they say, just add some detail now. And you're like, no!
Yeah, it's a dialogue at many levels. There's the verbal dialogue of you talking backwards and forwards about what you want. There's a dialogue where the drawing is a turn in the dialogue, and you've got to make sure that they understand what this scribble looks like and how it might translate into the final thing. And you might pass that backwards and forwards and have different iterations of that. There might be scripts that are part of it, and annotations or drawings around the side of scripts. And so there's a lot of kind of to and fro that needs to happen, and people need to be ready for that.
Mm-hmm. And what I said at the beginning, if there's anyone here who's a illustrator who's not interested in working with academia, here's my pitch. You might have some knowledge on this. The page rates are better than comic industry page rates. When academics can get money, they are, I wouldn't say they're liberal with it, but they understand the value of the work a lot more than the regular comics industry does.
Yeah.
The work is infrequent, and you've got all these additional obstacles to overcome, and you really got to be on top of your ball with understanding how briefing works and working in a professional higher education environment, which is a different set of skills, but you can learn those skills. You learn how to draw, you can learn those skills as well. So I would say that is a kind of a real benefit you can extract from that. I think that was where the question was, and then we kind of started.
I can also say, though, if you're an illustrator and you don't work with academics, I think increasingly, I hate to say it, but with the onset of AI, pure images are, that industry of just image making may well be obliterated in the future. And the more meaning and communication and that we can infuse our art with, the longer, the more it can survive what AI is going to do to destroy our art forms. And I really do believe that. And that kind of human to human connection, communication of ideas, I think that's all the more important. And I also do think attention spans are shrinking. People are becoming more visually minded, and I think to get pages and pages of quite detailed research out there, we do need to find different ways of communicating and reaching lay audiences as well. And one thing we do find with positive negatives is insane. Every time we put something out, people will say, wow, we gave this to policymakers and they were reading the comics on the way back home from the conferences on the plane, but also my 8-year-old son, who was never interested in my research, just picked a comic up and read it cover to cover. And it's really interesting how you can engage those audiences. And we see it all the time. And people are like, how? How can this engage an 8-year-old and at the same time a policymaker? But it really does engage all those audiences. So we know the power of the media, and we see it time and time again. There's no surprise to us. But it's always a delight. I mean, my little niece, she's 6 years old. She sat through all the films I made on water scarcity, and I'm like, great, you would never have known that information before.
Something interesting that as well, which I think maybe comics are kind of unique in this as well, but if you print the comics, you exactly what you mean, like policymakers people will just pick up comics and read them, like a floppy, and just thumb through it just because it's an interesting artifact to look at. So if you're researching, no one's gonna, if you print off your PhD, unless someone's coming to research you, then I'm going to pick that up off the side and thumb through it and have an understanding of what you worked really hard on. Whereas if you've got an 8-page comic, they can flick through it and they might go, I've kind of got a, and I know what this is about, and then they choose to pursue it or not. But the fact that comics are artifacts, like they're all here on the table, and everything, we all picked up something as soon as we walked in and flicked through it. There's something about it where we're visceral animals. We want that connection. So if you can make your research more physical, why wouldn't you?
Yeah. And it's also really useful when we do projects, working in villages all over the world. It's a really amazing resource because you can take it back to the people who you were interviewing originally and give it back to them. And also they can pick up pen and paper and completely, barely any money at all, can start drawing their own responses. So I think that's one of the joys of the medium. There's so few barriers to entry. You just need a pen and paper. So it's not just the kind of one-way feed of information. It can be interactive. I've even created comics with pages in the back which you can draw your own stuff in for adults as well. It can be incredibly interactive. Yeah.
I think in terms of the relationship between the researcher and the creator, there might be something to say around equity in relation to kind of not identical but corresponding experiences of precarity as well. Again, not that the experiences of a freelance artist are the same as being a precarious academic, but there's something in there that we're all clamoring for funding, we're all clamoring for work essentially. I wonder if that kind of shared experience could produce a kind of collaborative relationship that has an ethic of care, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly found that when we've worked with people, they've come to us with briefs, and then we've asked what's your budget, not because the follow-up question is, well, we'll have all the budget, but because we understand, there's only so much research for, like, how much of it is designated to go onto this. We go, okay, well, we can spend $2,000 on it, and then we can say, okay, well, it would be reasonable for us to live at this in X time frame. And, kind of like building on my earlier answer is some projects you're really excited for, and you're like, I want to work on that project because I just think it would be really cool. And, I assume, I don't know, but I assume that academics strongly believe in things and they want their research to be out there, and, they care about the fields they're in. So when you've got a bit of research like that comes to you, if it's something that you care about as well, you lower your rates because you're like, I want to be a part of that project. So yeah, I've certainly, and when that's not been the case, often commercial prospects will be a bit ruder about, well, I can get it cheaper elsewhere, so I will go and get it cheaper elsewhere.
Yeah.
Academics tend to be, that's your boundary. It was an academic who I was really excited about a project and talking about it, and like, oh, I've got this idea and I've got this idea, and he was like, this is scope creep. He was like, don't do that. And I was like, okay. And he was like, stick within. He wasn't being cruel, but he was saying, all those are great ideas, but I've only got money for these ideas. Yeah. And like, he was the one who said that, not me. So I learned that, and I was like, oh, good. And every time I spoke to a client about that, or a collaborator about that, who's worked in academia, they've got it straight away. Like, yeah.
I think it is more ethical, isn't it? If you look at some of the jobs which, you hear people doing in the comic industry, I mean, there's a lot of pig. Sorry. And also in publishing in general, in the commercial world, people really will get what they can cheaply. And I do think there's more of a kind of ethical boundary in academia, definitely. And they have to justify payment as well. So, they'll look at like what is a fair day rate, and they'll want to have, union figures for that. And it's really difficult. I mean, I wrote a budget recently for an academic proposal, and they were using the Artist England union rate. And everyone was laughing because you're like, it's so rare to be paid fairly. If you actually look at the length of time, comics are massively, I think out of most of the art forms, they're the most labor intensive, except stock frame animation. Those people are sadists. We're semi-sadists. But I do think that, like, well, masochist, not sadist. Sadist as well, if you're working with them. The writing's quicker.
The only difficult barrier, and I'm sure everyone knows this who works in a university, is how long it clears, how long your payment takes to clear. So you're like, because it's a payment system, and then you'll get paid in. And
if you get on a PAYE,
yes,
for 1 hour of work, I'm sorry.
I guess we work in these institutions, and we have to work within the limitations quite often, and that even comes down to like the kind of publishing that we're able to do within academia as well. So it's like, if you want to publish a comic with an academic press, like, they don't know how to do it most often. We are kind of running out of time, so I'm going to ask you this final question that is quite speculative, but I think quite important. If we're looking ahead and we want to, place value on comics as a mode of research and as a way of doing research, and as a form of kind of collaboration between different types of actors, what resources, structures, or changes need to be put in place to enable those kinds of collaborations?
I mean, we've talked about this before, haven't we? We did like a big roundtable looking at industries, and I think a networking, some kind of how do we connect artists with academics on a larger scale. I think there are a lot of academics who are interested in this. I remember recently just sending emails to a bunch of professors on a specific subject which I was interested in, and by the end of 24 hours all of them had gone back to me. There's a kind of mutual understanding that they need their research given to a mass audience, and that we can do that. So I think finding a system so that more researchers can get in contact with more artists would be really good. I mean, and positive negatives maybe can do that, because we are working with so many artists and so many academics But yeah, it would be great to do that on a mass scale in the UK.
Yeah.
How do you find most of your work? Is it?
I think it's through word of mouth through Jordan, because usually he's the first because he's the artist, so he's the most visible.
Yeah.
And people then go, "Can you illustrate?" And then usually goes, "Yeah, but I don't want to have to write it, so I'll subcontract to the person I always subcontracted to." I think there's a thing in the States called Bobcat Comics. Have you heard of that?
What?
Bobcat.
Oh yeah,
Comics.
I heard about that.
So,
yeah, it was mentioned in a.
Yeah, I think they're like a kind of a setup, like a network of academics and creators, and I think things like that, more hubs, because there's loads of people who are kind of, it's like quite atomized and lots of freelancers working on their own, and then academics kind of stumbling across them. I'm not saying there should be like a directory or something like that, but establishing a network of trustworthy freelancers and creatives who understand the ethics and understand the deliverables, so that when academics need that, there's some resources they can just quite quickly find, and then maybe
that's really relevant to the Comics Cultural Impact Collective. The next thing which we're doing is making a hub for comics in the UK, so they'll have like a section for academics, a section for publishers, a section for artists, and that kind of resource would really be really valuable to sit there. A centralized place where we can get the collaboration going, because we know, and having some examples of the success of them, the impact, like we've all got so many examples, haven't we? It would just be really good to kind of have that in one place that people can see.
You've got notes.
Yeah, I've got notes. From my point of view, one of the things is finding publishers that are willing to take a risk on what might seem like a rather odd form and rather niche form, and be willing to produce beautiful books like Nick's, like Hocus Pocus or Understanding Comics, because it can be quite expensive to produce all of these illustrated books, and perhaps because it's non-traditional, then it sits between the kind of beautiful comics line, which has a very wide audience, and the very niche academic scholarship kind of publishing, whereby books are very, very expensive and only libraries buy them. And whilst you guys were talking about payments and page rates and so on, thinking, it's much better for academics, I was thinking, no, you don't get a lot of money for writing academic texts. I was paid more for doing one drawing of a university than I was for my entire comics studies thesis. So there's not much money in that, and the academic publishing world is kind of a little. It's working on a rather outdated sense of how you get paid for your work, which I think is no longer the case. You also
the output doesn't have to be a physical book. Certainly when we do stuff for positive and negative, it's sometimes like a floppy, it's sometimes just showing before a lecture, it's sometimes digital. I think that the joy of comics is there's quite a few different avenues as well, what you can produce.
One of the other limits for what you can produce in academic comics work is around the laws about copyright and fair use. What takes up a load of my time and money, because the author has to pay for it themselves, is securing permissions for using images, particularly by the large publishing houses. Now, mostly when I'm able to get to authors, they are fine with it. Yeah, reproduce my images, that's totally cool. But it takes an awful lot of time to go through it. And another project that I had was to publish my extensive 10 years of notes from comic scholars. But the publisher that I initially approached said, you're going to have to get permissions for all of these people. And it's like, no way. I started to just do the sums on how many people to contact, and that would take up my entire time. So a sort of more acceptance of the use of visual images being reproduced in the way that you would quote other people's work, right, would help comics academia to flourish.
Okay. Well, I'd love to just sit here and listen to you blathering on another hour, but we started late, so we're finishing a little bit late. If you would like to ask questions, discuss with each other, whatever, please do so downstairs in the foyer, where there'll be drinks and snacks, and the artwork, of course. But for the time being, would you join me in thanking our speakers?
Please.
Great. Thank you so much for coming again. And yeah, I hope to see you downstairs in a few minutes.